Hello and welcome to today's meeting of the Health and Social Care Select Committee at the London Borough of Hillingdon. This meeting is being broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel Hillingdon London. The purpose of this committee is to monitor services provided by health partners and adult social care and review their performance. We also undertake in-depth reviews and witness sessions on specific topics and submit our findings to the decision-making cabinet. My name is Councillor Nick Denys and I'm the chair of this committee. Before we start, I have some important housekeeping for everyone present. Please ensure your mobile phones are on silent. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow officers out of the building. Please keep your microphones muted when you aren't speaking and then unmute to speak. And as chair, I'll call on those to speak. And it's not written here, but obviously because we've moved to sort of a paperless system, everyone will be on screens tonight because that's where all our papers are, just to let anyone who's watching who's interested know that. Okay, so we're going to start with the meeting. Nikki, do we have any apologies for absence?
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Rita Chamdale and Councillor Adam Bennett is here as her substitute.
You're very welcome, Councillor Bennett. I know you substituted a few times for us and you'll always provide very good value to us, so welcome back. Right, does anybody have any declarations of interest before we start the meeting? No? We're all good? Fantastic. The minutes of the 23rd of January. Councillor Cawthorne, you would like to raise an issue with the minute?
I would. Not so much accuracy, although it could be accuracy actually. The issue we had around, let's pick the item to be precise, it is, well, adult social care update. So as you look at the recommendation at the bottom, one of them was for some information to come back to us about digitisation in the context of how we are supporting older people who have been identified as needing support in accessing the council for services. It seems a bit woolly, a little bit vague that. I thought we were a bit more specific about our ask about what information we could expect to get and when. I thought, could we perhaps have a little bit of a pushback on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I propose that we discuss that maybe under the work programme. I mean, are you thinking of maybe sort of us trying to pencil in a date for that to be an actual agenda item, or...?
If it needs to be, or otherwise information about what's happening, because it just seems to be, I struggle on various committees to nail down progress on this. It seems to be quite vague and, open-ended, when I think we really need to know what's happening and when. So if a separate discussion would be useful, fine, but equally, if we can request the information, I'm happy for that as well.
So, should we request the information? Oh, Gary, would you like to come in at this point?
Chair, I was going to suggest, because one of the things I was actually going to suggest as part of this report at a future meeting, looking at tech-enabled care, and I would suggest the committee may want to include that particular issue as part of that item.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds good to me. So, Councillor Cawthorne?
But again, such information as can be made available now would be welcome, I think, because we've been asking for a little while. So
some written information.
Such information, in terms of what is happening in that regard.
Yeah, okay.
That would be useful.
So maybe when we get to the work programme, we will discuss, when we might have that as the meeting, and obviously if there's any information before then. But, Gary, the work programme essentially follows the item you're at, so if you stay for that, you can sort of let us know maybe if when we want to see you is okay, and for example, if for example we go for the next meeting, then actually the written information could be part of the information for the next meeting depending on what works. Gary,
what I was actually going to suggest as part of the substantive item is, because there are discussions that have actually got to be undertaken about the future model with the leader and cabinet member, was actually going to suggest bringing that to the committee in July.
Okay. I think that sounds sensible. I know from our personal point of view, Councillor Cawthorne won't be on the committee in July, will you? Because you'll be elevated to mayor. You would be welcome to attend still, and we'd send you the information. But I think, obviously that makes most sense. Yeah. So if there's any information that could be maybe shared via Nikki beforehand for us to read, that would be super useful, just out of interest. But I think July probably would be good. But we'll confirm that under the work plan. Okay. Thank you. Is everyone else happy with the minutes? Fantastic, thank you very much. So So we come to item 4, which is the exclusion of the press and public. All matters are public, aren't they, at this meeting? Fantastic. And now we come on to item 5, which is our substantive item for this meeting. So it's our first witness session in our investigation into adult social care, early intervention and prevention. So in front of us today we have Gary Collier, who's Health and Social Care Integration Manager, Gavin Fernandez, who's Assistant Director of Immediate Response, and Kelly O'Neill, Director of Public Health. So I'll hand over to you guys to do your presentation, then we'll ask questions.
Lovely, thank you, Councillor. So the report that you have in front of you focuses on prevention and early intervention, and presents how this fits with adult social care. I have taken the liberty with my colleagues to add in the adult social care and public health because that is the wider department, and I think it's just an opportunity to recognise that prevention starts right from the outset of life. So we're going to particularly focus on service demand, approaches to prevention and early intervention, and the interface between health partners and adult social care, and give some examples of the preventative services that are being commissioned by the Council. Fundamentally, the importance of tackling prevention across health and social care and shifting away from treatment is one of the 3 priorities in the draft 10-year NHS Forward Plan that's due to be published later on this year. And the expectation is that through health and care systems, we work together to invest in evidence-based prevention services that are built on health education that lead to sustained behaviour change and healthier lives. However, prevention is not wholly about health and social care services, but also about keeping people and population healthy through the responsibilities of the wider council, which I would call the social determinants of health. So local authorities are the placemakers of healthy communities and are responsible for public health and the interventions and services that have the greatest impact on improving health. Those services aren't health and social care services. They are the infrastructure planning within local councils, their health, education, green spaces, and all of those sort of kind of social or wider determinants that are part of the council responsibilities. So actually, the responsibility for prevention lies with the decision makers of the council, which are councillors yourselves. And part of that infrastructure is about how do we as a council create the healthiest option being the easiest option, and getting it right from the start, because actually if we can prevent ill health for as long as possible, we can keep people healthier longer, there becomes less demand on health and social care, and actually people have better, more independent and empowered lives. And fundamentally, if you keep people healthy for longer, it drives the economy, it drives and builds on thriving communities and allows sort of, income generation, and people become self-determined. Fundamentally, health is wealth and wealth is health. So what we've got put in this paper is other examples of prevention investment that's in the council, and whether this is provided by the NHS or by wider public health services, such as universal services for families that protect vulnerable and prevent children being at risk and coming into care services, action to prevent violence against individuals and communities, and really importantly, action to prevent people becoming homeless. And fundamentally, from a public health perspective, if you've got people in the right accommodation, they're able to live more independent, healthier lives. And really importantly for this report, action that prevents or delays the onset of frailty. What we do have is a significantly increased older population living longer, but living longer for more years and in sort of a unhealthy stage of life. And what we have presented in this paper is a really clear direction that we are going to have significantly more people who are over the age of 65. Life expectancy is increasing, but it doesn't mean people's healthy life expectancy is longer. It's more years being unhealthy and more years potentially needing health and care services. So you'll see in Table 1 so this is from the 2021 census and what our population estimates look like for 2031. So in 10 years' time, what we're seeing is about 9,000 additional people over the age of 65, and with that comes increasing demand for health and social care. So the data in Section 8 is being provided through Hillingdon Health and Care Partnership, and it's basically the principles upon which we're anticipating increased demand in health services. And some of it's quite sobering. So, for example, 48% of, which is 127,500 people over the age of 18 registered with a Hillingdon GP are living with one or more long-term health condition, which makes it, with Harrow as a borough, having the greatest sort of prevalence of long-term conditions of a population.
Kelly, sorry, can I just interrupt you just very briefly? What is hypertension?
Oh, sorry, high blood pressure. High blood pressure.
So high blood pressure. So
yes, apologies for that.
I didn't notice that, because obviously that affects a lot of people. Yeah.
Oh yes, and unfortunately a lot of people it's undetected, so which is why one of the Hillingdon Health and Care Partnership priorities is to identify as many people who are walking around with high blood pressure, because obviously that leads predominantly to strokes and cardiovascular disease, which are the biggest killers in the country and in Hillingdon. We're not different in that respect. So the top 5 long-term health conditions in the borough are high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, obesity and diabetes, and most of those occur concurrently in individuals, so it's unlikely that somebody suffering from any one of those is likely just to have one. But a really good example is people with high blood pressure accounts for 50% of the emergency unplanned activity in hospital, and accounts for 20% in adults of working age, which is increasing year by year. And as soon as you start becoming unwell and starting to create sort of the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke, your ability to work somewhat becomes compromised. And going back to that, how do you drive the economy? How do you improve people's life standards? And how do you keep people healthier for longer? Tackling things like hypertension is really, really important. In terms of our data, people over the age of 65 account for approximately 13% of the resident population in the borough, but they are high users of health and social care, so they make up 30% of GP and unplanned acute care and 40% of emergency hospital admissions. But that's to be expected. You would expect that in an older population. But what we are looking at is the data that says 4,400 residents account for 50% of all emergency admissions to hospital. And again, these are kind of considered high demand service users, and there is lots of work that's being really focused on tackling that, and how do we support people with their health conditions in the community more. And in line with that also, we've got 20%, we've got 22,165 we've got 22,165 unpaid carers, of whom 20% are providing 50 or more hours of care a week, and that affects their health and well-being, and they are a statutory responsibility of adult social care. So preventing them becoming unwell is really important, not only to protect them, but the person that they're caring for. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Kelly. So I will take us through some points now in terms of, we're seeing an increase in long-term care needs. So between 2019 and 2024, there was a 4.5% increase in people aged 18 to 64 requiring long-term care. That's a 3% increase was observed for residents aged 65 and over during the same period. Overall, there was a 2.2% increase in the number of people aged 65 plus requiring long-term care from 1920 into 23-24, and a 13% increase for people aged 18 to 64. So what does that do for adult social care? So between April to December 24, we had 3,967 people receiving services, with 57% of those being aged 65 and above. Working aged adults, 18 to 64 with mental health needs, we saw a 450% increase in referrals. In 2019, we had 285. In 2024, we had 1,286. A lot of that can be explained by the impacts of the pandemic and the legacy in terms of how that's impacted on people's mental health. And then people with learning disabilities, autism, approximately 40 people transition from children's to adult social care services annually. People with an autism-only diagnosis have seen a 20-fold increase in support from 18 people in 2019 to 350 people in 2024. And obviously there's been lots of discussion, it's in the social discourse, it's in the social media realms. So, factors driving increased demand: ageing population, which we've already said, more people living longer with long-term conditions, families less available to provide support, people living longer without a carer, and a changing kind of facade of diagnoses and comorbidities. So, again, this echoes the importance of prevention and early intervention, keeping people healthier and independent for longer. Health and Wellbeing Board being very focused on reviewing the investment in evidence-based prevention and early intervention. Improving health delays the onset of ill health and reduces the demand upon adult social care. So, preventative approaches, priorities, reducing prevalence of long-term conditions. As Kelly's referenced, hypertension leads to strokes. I know personally from looking at our placement figures in adult social care, the kind of, whether it's not the primary driver, secondary to our placements is driven by strokes and a history of strokes alongside other comorbidities. So we're looking at a revision of the Hillingdon Older Persons Plan to focus on more ambitious prevention and early intervention. Obviously we need to engage with residents, we need to talk to them, these need to be co-produced drivers for change. That was my overview, and I shall now pass you to Mr. Collier.
Thank you, Gavin. Chair, what we've actually done in the report is actually set out a number of the preventative services that we have in place. What we haven't actually done, and I think in the report, is actually mentioned so much the interface with health services. There's an opportunity, I think, probably to pick that up in a later witness session, and I'll with your permission, Chair, I'll make some suggestions about future attendees at future witness sessions. As you can see in paragraph 20 of the report, we're currently spending about just over £6.3 million on preventative services. The range of services include partnerships with the voluntary sector, and what we've actually sought to do over the last year is actually bring multiple contracts together, or switch from grants to contracts in order to give services long-term stability. As is set out in the report, we've recently gone through a tender process which has actually led to a wide variety of different smaller contracts actually being brought together, particularly in the sphere of information advice and guidance. So what we're actually looking with that is a single provider. We've encouraged the way that the service has actually been shaped. We've encouraged partnership arrangements, or we've encouraged providers to work in partnership with one another, because we certainly know that similar arrangements in other services, carers in particular, has actually been particularly successful, and certainly in the sphere of information, advice and guidance, we've wanted to avoid the necessity of residents having to go to multiple organisations. So it's a kind of sort of one-stop shop approach. This, along with a number of other contracts as I've identified in the report, is actually due to go to Cabinet next month with recommendations for award of contracts. I've suggested in the report about inviting the new providers of those services, so that would be information, advice and guidance, carers and mental health services too. This would actually be to the June meeting, which actually takes into consideration the process that needs to follow the Cabinet decision, as in it would not be possible to invite providers until they've actually been formally notified that they've been awarded the contract. Not an insignificant point. You can see within the report as well, we've highlighted particularly the reablement service, and what I've also done is actually highlighted some of the funding streams for this, and you'll see that to those main funding streams of the Public Health Grant and the Better Care Fund. As there's multiple funding streams within the Better Care Fund, I've tried to help out the committee a little bit by actually setting out what they are. But the reablement service is fundamental to our prevention offer. You'll see some of the national metrics that are associated with that service, and what we have seen, or what we will see in during 24-25 is both an increase in the number of older people being referred from discharge into reablement, and also an uptake of people in the community. As colleagues have actually said, to emphasise, the whole objective of the exercise is to keep people in the community for as long as possible. Chairman, I won't go into more detail about the services, give the committee the opportunity to raise questions they may have. Going back to the point I was made earlier, and suggesting invitees to future witness sessions, with permission, I was going to suggest that, say, to the March meeting, we have representatives from the Confederation to speak about neighbourhood working, and the change, the development of the neighbourhood model, and how that will actually assist with preventing or delaying acceleration of need. I was also going to suggest, Chair, about inviting the provider of the reablement service. What we haven't spelt out in the report is that the company delivering the reablement service is also delivering the bridging care service, and the pathway out of hospital is through bridging and then into reablement. The purpose of the bridging service is really to enable people who have care needs to return home as quickly as possible, and then they're referred on to the reablement service to assist them with learning or relearning activities of daily living, with the aim to either to reduce or to eliminate the need for ongoing care. And as we mentioned before, if the committee is agreeable, we can actually bring the technology-enabled care item. So it's essentially how we're going to be using, or how we're proposing to use technology to support our residents to live in the community, and also as a means of accessing services, some of which will be addressed by the witness session with the third sector providers. So I'll leave it there, Chairman.
Thank you to all three of you, and thank you for the Councillor Bells.
Sorry, just very quickly, just so it's on the record that I'm on the management board of Citizens Advice.
Okay, okay, thank you.
And,
thank you.
On the record.
Declaration of interest, but a very good interest to have. Councillor Bells, that's good. No, thank you for the paper, and thank you for the presentation. In terms of your suggestions for future witnesses, they all sound good. One of the things that I think we'd be interested in is to speak to sort of those who've benefited from this. I mean, it doesn't have to be in this formal setting. Also, maybe visiting some programs that are useful to see about how public health is embedded in the community. So just some ideas about over the next few months of what would be good for us to go and visit in terms of speaking to people who are benefiting from certain programs. I'll never forget that one day before I became a chairman of a committee and I had my own little office, or share an office with somebody in the civic centre, when I used to have meetings here, I used to go and work in Uxbridge Library, because obviously the upstairs space was very good. I remember once I came down and I saw the sort of sit-down exercise classes you were doing for mainly elderly people, and I thought that was such a wonderful use of public space, for example, in terms of, doing something which obviously has a social benefit and a sort of physical benefit which comes together in public health. So that is something that will never leave me. But if there are sort of potential programs for us to go and look at which have those benefits, that would be useful. So thank you. I've got two questions, and I'll open up to the rest of the committee members who I'm sure have got lots of questions themselves. The one thing that I think was not in the paper that really interests me is how do we monitor performance, and how do we judge performance? And I know this is very, very important, obviously, because budgets are being sort of, budgets aren't really growing, but demand is growing. And so how do we know what is making a difference, and how do we monitor that?
one of the things that we've actually done within the is to strengthen the outcomes and output requirements. So all of the contracts will actually are currently managed by our contracts and supply relationships team. What we will be, or what we're in the process of doing, is actually strengthening that whole sort of commissioning and contracting function with additional capacity provided through the Better Care Fund. What the supplier and contracts relationship team is currently doing is actually receiving information from providers, and the frequency of the monitoring really depends on the value, because we aim to ensure that that's actually proportionate. One of the factors that we've taken into consideration in developing the new model is really around our sort of capacity to manage the contracts. So both in terms of actually increasing that capacity, but also reducing the number of the contracts, which actually enables us to work more closely with a fewer number of providers.
Okay, so, yeah, do you want to go, Gavin?
Sorry, if I could just also add to that in terms of the reablement contract. So aside from business as usual contract monitoring, we have obviously operational managers that are tracking that on a daily basis. We use Power BI dashes to track that, so we know how many residents are benefiting from reablement, we know how long they're receiving reablement for, and we know what the outcomes are. And that's our ability to track that, which in the paper you'll see the costs avoided. So those people that no longer had services or no longer required services 90 days after the reablement had concluded. So there is very rigorous monitoring of performance.
Just to add to that as well, is that technology is actually enabling us to gain much more information about the delivery of services much more frequently. So we are in a much better position now than we've ever been, really, to have a feel about what those services are doing.
I mean, I think this is an area that definitely I think we need to do a deeper dive into. I mean, not necessarily saying that a committee format might not be the best place to do a deeper dive into it, but maybe some committee members who might be interested can go in and look at how the monitoring works and how that feeds into sort of decision-making process, because it is so important to try and evidence what is working. So I think that is definitely something that we will want to look more in depth into. And my next question is, how do you manage the challenge that everything is public health? So you mentioned how, I'm looking at you, Kelly, I know it's something I'm probably repeating back something you said about 7 months in the room that I was in, and I'm repeating it back to you, but you mentioned obviously the importance of the right accommodation for so much in terms of person's health, and I completely understand that, but we all know massive pressures of giving people the right accommodation in Hillingdon. And there are plenty of other things where, look at our green spaces, providing those good green spaces is a good opportunity for people to be healthy, but how do we encourage their use and all that sort of stuff. So how does public health seep into other decisions that are made?
In an improving way. So the public health grant is ring-fenced, and there are certain criteria that you have to adhere to. So my responsibility with the Section 151 officers is to sign off the public health grant and provide assurance to OHID and the Secretary of State that the grant is being used in line with that ring-fenced criteria. With reference to your comment about everything is public health, the primary use of the grant or the allocation has to be directly health. And obviously, if you talk about sort of all of those areas, you can actually frame it that almost anything is fundamentally about improving health and well-being. If it's a statutory responsibility of the council, it cannot be used. The public health grant cannot be used, because that would be considered substitution. But from the public health grant we get every year, there is roughly about £5.5 million that's invested into council services, non-statutory council services, where the outcomes can fundamentally improve population health and well-being. So I oversee that through making sure that the outcomes being achieved are linked to the eligibility criteria, and I'm able to influence how that grant is spent to maximise those outcomes. So as Gary says, from the Better Care Fund and the Public Health Grant, there's roughly about £6 million that's invested into adult social care. I also invest £1.6 million into children's services. I invest money into the wider infrastructure, such as fundamentally certain activities that go on within the council, where we can say that focusing on much more on that kind of health outcome element really makes it quite eligible for funding. So a lot of that money is invested already into the council, but it has to be non-statutory services. So there's always a little bit of sort of a grey area where we have to really account for it and just make sure that the reporting that's done 6 monthly by services in the council that are receipt of that grant have to really demonstrate all of that criteria is being met. And make sure that we can assure that spend is eligible. It's really key.
Public health goes wider than that spend, though, doesn't it? Public health goes wider than that spend. I suppose part of the question that I was asking, and that was a very interesting answer. I think getting more into sort of what that money is spent on and how, and I think it's very interesting. It's on non-statutory services, which do deserve the money, but obviously, as a council makes lots of decisions about lots of stuff, whether it's where to resurface roads and pavements, for example, in terms of the type of housing it provides is another example. I mean, in those things that aren't sort of related directly to the public health grant, I mean, how much interest is there in sort of the council decision-making process in those aspects of how it will affect public health, I suppose, is one of the things I'm driving at.
I think there's a lot of improvement that can be made. I'd like to think that we as a council put health and well-being as a fundamental outcome for all decisions. That's a kind of a work stream called Health in All Policies, where the council makes decisions based on whether it is advantageous to improving population health, public health, wider well-being. I think we're a little way from that, if I'm being really honest. And I think that if it would be a good recommendation, and I would wholeheartedly welcome that recommendation if that were to be one of the committee's findings. Just to pick up, Councillor, and just in terms of that wider spend, there are parts of the criteria for the public health grant is mandated services that we have to provide. While they haven't been included in this paper, some of them are prevention services. So things such as the Healthy Child Programme is our biggest contract. That's a health visiting school nursing service, which accounts for over £4.5 million. Sexual health services, which is over £3 million. Drug and alcohol services, which are comparable. We've mentioned NHS health checks, that's around £500,000. And various things such as oral health promotion amongst children and adults. That's a discretionary spend, it's not mandated. So what we try and do is make sure that we focus on what are the priorities of the area and how do we put prevention sort of as key in terms of reducing demand and reducing sort of poor health outcomes as a result. It's a difficult balancing position.
Thank you. Right, I'll be quiet now. I could ask lots more questions, but we have lots more time. Councillor Punja.
Thank you. I think it follows on from the Chair's comments, actually. So the stark reality of this 48% kind of hits you as you start reading this report. And one of the things that kind of the first question that came up to me is are the causes, which you have kind of talked about in terms of the environment, housing, all these other things. But when you look at the the 5 areas, these are synonymous to areas of deprivation. And so in response to kind of where Councillor Denys was kind of moving on in terms of how do we put these into policies, or where can public health be seen in other places that we can influence council decisions to be made, I would welcome that it could be a part of policy making of health and well-being of our residents, because primarily that begins you've got an active, healthy and economically driven population. But one of the things is that how does one address that through kind of the prevention structures that are being put in place, because quite rightly it starts at prevention to keep people going. So just kind of wanted to link that in and just identify that this is related to deprivation.
Yes, the more deprived an area, the poorer the health is of the population in general, and areas that have a diverse population tend to be have lower levels of deprivation. It's well understood, which is why sort of improving wealth and creating opportunity, jobs, good employment as a local authority, targeting those areas where there is higher vulnerability and higher health risk, and gaining sort of wealth and opportunity in those areas, it should be a really key ambition. In terms of public health, most of our work is targeted at the more deprived areas where there is a non-universal approach. So we do a lot more work in terms of sort of hypertension and focus work on sort of cancer screening, oral health in those areas. Not least, I would say, because even when there is a universal service, what we tend to find is that people in more deprived areas are less likely to access services. So we need to make much more of an effort to provide that access and provide services as close as possible and as convenient as possible. So it's well understood that we do weight our services towards those areas with the highest need.
I would be interested in evidence of where other people have done things well in this aspect, because the point that Councillor Punja raises is an extremely well-known thing in general, and obviously there's lots of local authorities in the UK and places abroad, obviously, which are trying to tackle this problem. So if you think there are any good sort of case studies or examples from elsewhere, please do sort of forward them to Nikki, because those would be of interest to us.
Depending on the different areas, we have case studies of sort of exemplar practice. What we tend to find, obviously the public health grant is weighted in terms of the allocation we get to a number of criteria. One is the overall level of the borough of sort of index of multiple deprivation, which takes account of 7 factors and sort of really identifies deprivation. But it's also targeted to the percentage of people who die under the age of 75, which is identified as a kind of a proxy measure for poor health outcomes. So our allocation, whilst is roughly about £20 million, but if you compare us to, say, some of the inner London boroughs get significantly more in areas of really extreme deprivation. So the area in the country who is number 1 in terms of the index of multiple deprivation is Blackpool. Their grant will be representative of that. So what we try and do in terms of that allocation is try and focus on the priorities, because the grant doesn't cover everything, but weight those resources and weight those priorities to the areas with the greatest need, which are areas of the borough where there is quite a big disparity between health outcomes.
Yeah, one more. Come back, sorry.
Sorry, just because you had these priorities that you mentioned in terms of the contracts that you were putting out of those, which are the ones that you feel more, like for example when you talked about drug and alcohol or sexual health education, which ones are the most that you think that the residents are needing more, or just that they have more demand for, or and then you can see the benefits from in terms of what you're delivering?
Those services aren't specifically related to index of multiple deprivation. So the 0 to 19 service is a universal provision of healthy child programs. So every family will get access to a health visitor. Every family will get access to a school nurse. What we tend to do is just, there's a kind of an element of a sort of tiered offer. So if a family is more vulnerable, they get a kind of more enhanced offer. So it becomes a kind of universal plus and universal partnership plus, which it helps support families with the greatest need. Sort of areas like drug and alcohol, it tends to treat a relatively small number of people, but obviously the impact of drug and alcohol is that it targets incredibly vulnerable people, many of whom have not only got addiction problems but mental health problems, and that kind of, if you put a Venn diagram together, those are the kind of people that are more likely to be homeless and have chaotic lives. In terms of the sexual health service, it's a universal service, but the sort of sexually transmitted infections are on the rise. What you tend to find is poorer sexual health in more deprived communities, and obviously things like HIV, which is slightly different, is more prevalent in sort of different communities, not necessarily related to index of multiple deprivation and poverty. So all of those services are provided in a certain way to target the most at-risk populations. Things like cancer screening targets populations, whether that's age or gender, based on what is the most likely time that you'll pick up an early stage cancer. NHS health checks targets people who are over the age of 40 to identify as early as possible people who are at higher risk of long-term conditions, so we get them into treatment quicker. Again, that's universal services, but going back to what I said before, because of the access of people who are probably most in need of that services, there's a lot of effort to really target communities where there's low uptake and where there are people that are more at risk.
Thank you. Councillor Cawthorne.
Thank you very much. Very good report. Good to see you all here, and it certainly takes me back to when I had this cabinet responsibility. Quick anecdote, if I may, then a couple of questions. My late mother had a spell in Hillingdon Hospital a couple of years ago, and something she said to me stayed with me ever since, and that was her experience of being in a ward with a lot of older people, where people were crying out for company, for comfort, and people were actually welcoming being there because they have no contact whatsoever in their home lives. No social contact whatsoever. And I looked in vain around and about for anything about Hillingdon for All or social prescribing, that sort of stuff. Whether I just picked the wrong day to go or the wrong ward to visit, I don't know, but it just suggested to me there might be an opportunity, perhaps, to look at how joined up the partnership is in terms of really identifying people who are at risk of being isolated when they're elderly. We all know that they're disproportionately likely to have worse health outcomes, so it just felt like an opportunity to me. So I just want to share that anecdote, and just coming on the back of that. Gary, I think you talked about perhaps looking at opportunities to do further work. How are we engaging with service users and communities to co-produce early intervention strategies? Maybe with the comment that I've just made in mind, if you could give me a sense of how that's moving forward.
There is some work, additional. It is an area that where we are actually looking to improve in developing a sort of a co-production plan. There's a lot of work that's already being undertaken, certainly by some of the existing organisations. You'll be familiar, Councillor Cawthorne, with Carers Trust and the work that they're doing. And the new model of provision for the new contracted services do actually require providers to look more at outreach and going into the community. But there is work that we will be doing to enhance our approach to co-production, to working with residents and users of the services to shape commissioning in the future.
Can I come in there? So at the last meeting, I don't know whether it's the last meeting that I attended, but John Wheatley was here talking about the older person's plan, and one of the things that we said in the paper is that older person's plan needs a really proper refresh, and that's one of the things I think Sandra Taylor has said that the leader is really keen on us putting in place. But the report that was provided to the committee then did set out a whole sort of range of interventions, particularly that my team and the wider adult social care team, and supported by the voluntary community sector, have put into place sort of networks of communities, sort of dementia-friendly communities. And one of the things I know that Councillor Palmer is having conversations with one of my team is about is how do we create Hillingdon as an age-friendly community, an age-friendly borough, and what can we do to really sort of link back to the older person's plan. And just the last thing is that I'm really concerned about loneliness and social isolation, and that will be the theme of the annual public health report, which when I get round to finishing in the next couple of months will have a series of recommendations which will link to some of the conversation that we've had today.
Thank you. I did have a separate second question, if I may. Shall I just do that now? And it's staying with older people. So in the last year or two, we've taken the decision not to commission dining centre meals. We understand that. We understand why that can't be done. But where people are affected by that sort of thing, and again, being deputy mayor, you go out and about, you meet organisations, and I've been a few that I've not even come across, even after all my years. And I wonder to what extent where people can't access the service that was previously provided in Ricestead at the Unparked Dining Centre, for example, whether there's the awareness of what else is out there, because there are numerous voluntary organisations, church groups that do provide a regular meal and social contact, and we have an interest surely in making sure that older people don't slip through the gaps when suddenly we're not providing something. Again, that feels like an opportunity, so I don't know whether you have anything to say about that, but it just again feels like an opportunity to me.
Thank you, Councillor Cawthorne. Absolutely. So at the moment, we've realigned adult social care. I've now got immediate response service, so we are looking after the front door. So absolutely about the information and advice, people coming into adult social care and actually signposting them to the voluntary sector, making them aware of what other resources are available in the community. So it's not just, where things are decommissioned, actually we just need to think laterally around how we support our residents.
By the way, as we go along, I'm sort of going to summarise some key themes just so Nicky can put them down so we can come back and think to them. But just a couple of there. I mean, gaps in service and how do we respond. So the anecdote, Councillor Cawthorne, you mentioned, very powerful, partly because it's really known about, and that's an obvious place where issues like that could be dealt with. So the fact it wasn't being dealt with is something that's interesting for us to look at in terms of where are those obvious gaps and how they're can be filled, and also the communications and signposting. I think is such an important element as well. So those are two things that maybe we'll revisit. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. Some concerns about the current prevention services and bringing it all together into one. I think we had this discussion many times before in regards to the big companies that's coming in and literally getting the contract, and then you've got the smaller community groups or companies, self-employed groups who would like to access the service. And my concern is when the bid do come in, but I know you're not able to say who it is and when it is, will they inbuilt into that, will they be subcontracting the services out, and how will it affect what you're trying to achieve here?
If I can say, Chair, we've been very clear about the model of service provision that we actually required. I'm not in a position to say anything about any more about who the provider might be. What I would ask Councillor Nelson is if you can be a bit patient with us and wait for the meeting in I think in June, where we will have the providers of those services come along, and they will be able to tell you more about the model of service provision and hopefully allay your concerns.
Yep, so Cabinet should be making a decision in March. The providers should be coming to us in June, and in June we can talk to them about their service model and how they're incorporating that stuff. Okay, thank you.
I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to try and catch
them. So, Councillor Nelson, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you two more questions, because I've got everyone else who hasn't asked, and then if there are any at the end, some of those can be ticked off. We'll come back to you, okay? So two more questions.
Thank you. Under the mental health floating support service, concerns are raised there. I think it's shown that the uptake, there's lots of people seeking mental health, and the referral rate has gone sky high. My concern there is there's cases open each month leading to 1,924 activities to support families affected by dementia. How is this service, how is this void fill with increased referral and the amount of people coming? Have they got the staff to fill that?
So in terms of, we're talking about demand for social work assessments, mental health assessments. In essence, you know, some of the conversations that we've alluded to earlier on in terms of leveraging technology, we are in the process of having conversations with technologically providing services that can transcribe assessments. So in essence, we need to create the capacity. So there isn't any more money for more social workers, so actually we need to make the best use of the resources we have. If we can provide them with the tools to complete more assessments in less time and increase the quality of them, then that's some of the ambition in terms of how we're going to meet those demands.
The last question I'll put forward is, again, on the mental health. The annual funding is not a lot for 350 hours support for people living with mental health. Again, come back to the staff ratio. How is that being fulfilled? Because it's quite a high demand here.
I would say that this has actually proved quite successful. The service has actually managed to cope with the demand coming through. I mean, it's something that we obviously need to keep under review going forward, and this is a particular service that will be due for re-tender in the next 18 months.
Get a report back in how this is going to be moving forward, because what is stating in my understanding of this here is 350 hours work of support with people, and the mental health rate is rising. Will that be able to fulfill that?
That's something that we will need to look at the model, because the challenge that we face is actually working within resource constraints. So it's something that we will.
So, I mean, Gary, your assertion that this is quite successful obviously is pleasing, but if you could provide us with some evidence about what success means, that would be useful in some context, so we can sort of understand that.
Certainly.
That'd be good. Thank you. Councillor Martin.
Thank you. On to point 17, preventative approaches. You mentioned the importance of tackling loneliness and isolation in order to support inclusion and mental health. So keeping people engaged with their communities and the community in general. I'm sure all of us here know how difficult it is nowadays to engage with some of our residents, with the community. There's also a transient workforce in this borough due to the proximity of Heathrow, so people are away from their families. And of course, about 55%, I think, were maybe not born in the UK, so also away from their families. I just wonder how you encourage these individuals to engage with not just their community, but the community in general, in order to sort of mitigate that isolation. And are there any communities which are particularly easy to engage with, and those which are more difficult, and what are the barriers to us engaging? Thank you.
I couldn't tell you all of the different communities, and I think some communities are much better in terms of, or have a more active presence in terms of bringing together their community groups, and whether that's kind of through outreach, whether that's through networks of communities, whether it's people who are lived experience of, say, for example, Alzheimer's communities and dementia communities. There is a really strong network of that within this borough. In terms of sort of country of origin communities, there are really strong networks of some of the country of origin communities. But think fundamentally, I think it's far more focused on the resident population, but I do think that there are gaps. I mean, some of the concern I have, and which is sort of the focus of the annual public health report, will be the over 65 community, whereas we know that joining in and participating plays a really key part in inclusion, and inclusion improves health and well-being in general. That kind of, as Councillor Cawthorne was saying, that need to be connected with someone who cares. And I think that for us is probably a gap in terms of understanding what the level of need is, particularly, as we said, as that kind of community, that community with the age of 65 is getting older, and for many of their families can't afford to live close by, and actually have moved quite away. So there's quite a lot of people, we think, that are left on their own. Just in terms of mapping, I think there's probably a little bit of a gap in terms of the mapping of those, of sort of what are the connections that communities have, where if you kind of look in that kind of Venn diagram, where are the kind of outliers. And I pick up, Councillor, your point about the transient communities, or people whose communities are not living in the UK. Don't know the answer to that. There's a bit of a gap there in my knowledge.
I would agree.
Sorry?
I will mention one thing that's fresh in my mind. One of our social workers has done an amount of work in her own personal time developing the Pride Hub in Hillingdon. So in terms of engaging members of our community, giving them a safe space, somewhere to meet like-minded people, have a conversation, seek support. So there are lots of pockets of really good things, and as my colleague Kelly has said, it's about how we map those and bring them together.
Am I able to request the Pride Hub information? Because it would be interesting to visit and see the work that's done there. Thank you.
Councillor Bennett.
Thank you very much, Chair. So my interest in this is kind of increased recently. So last year, 2 female colleagues of mine died suddenly, unexpectedly, from heart attacks in their 50s, from issues that if they had been detected, they quite possibly would have been here today. And I suppose it's more a broad question around, it's right that the funding and the limited grants we get are directed to the areas where they're most in need, and that is generally areas where there's greater deprivation and there is a correlation between poor health. But at what point can anyone kind of proactively seek help? So my late grandmother always used to say that the older you get, the more people's lists you end up on. And she got to 90, and she was like, every sort of 10 years, you'll start getting even more letters and things through the post and even more phone calls. If I think of myself, so I'm 40 next year, is that too young to say, right, I'd like to go for a health check? I'm sure 40, 50 years ago these would have happened. Where would you go? Do you wait on the phone to the GP for 60, 90 minutes for them to go, well, look, it's not an emergency and we don't really do health checks? Do you go to the pharmacy? Does it fall to the local authority? Is it a private sector employer thing where they're focused on well-being? A combination of all, but just some guidance for, selfishly myself, but I think also the residents we represent, that people, if early intervention can result in people maybe proactively reaching out themselves, and they don't have to wait till they're on somebody's list to do that.
Yeah, knowing is key to preventing, isn't it? Exactly.
Yeah. So around the borough there are plenty of opportunities for people to get their blood pressure checked. There's blood pressure monitoring equipment in pharmacies, in general practices that you can just drop into. I think in some of our libraries, and we've got blood pressure monitoring loan schemes. For the NHS health checks, everyone over the age of 40 gets invited to a health check. And so you should, your GP, so look forward to that. Your GP should be inviting you. We pay about £500,000 a year for that to happen. I would say that uptake is not as high as I'd like it. I love uptake to be well over 80%. Roughly it's about 50%, so that's why there's kind of a lot of targeted activity. What we do tend to find, as I was saying earlier, is that people who are able to access their GP, particularly during the working day, are more likely to access their NHS health check. But actually there's lots of opportunities. Gyms, for example, in the borough will all have blood pressure monitoring equipment. What I also would say is that some people who do have heart attacks or do have strokes often will not be showing any signs at all of any kind of level of risk, and it's just one of those things where I think the more that we can test, and the more that we can get people to monitor their blood pressures and take the opportunities where they are in the community, of which there are lots around, the more that people can sort of being able to, when something's slightly different, they can access their GPs. But I think one of the things that was being picked up earlier was the location of blood pressure machines. I'm sure one of my team were doing a location where all the blood pressure machines are. Was it DFibs? One of the two. But we can map that and put that on the website.
Yeah, no, that would be really good. And just to pick up on something you said, so we fund GP practices having the kind of blood pressure check. Was it $500,000, you said?
Yes, NHS Health. The NHS Health Check is one of the mandated requirements from the public health grant, so we have to fund that, and we pay GPs to do it.
Yeah, that's quite interesting to know. Yeah,
I mean,
thank you.
I think rising that must be an ambition, but also you're right, knowledge about. Yeah, I mean, I had no idea that blood pressure machines were so freely and easily available. So, for example, there is stuff out there that people don't know about that they could use to sort of to check stuff, and so that's interesting. Councillor Nelson, sorry, and also apologies, but we're obviously I've got Councillor Bells who wants to come in, who's not spoken yet, so and then Councillor Punger's going to come in with a question, and then at the end I'll if there's anything else you want to add, but obviously this is the beginning of a long sort of investigation process, so there's going to be a lot of chance to sort of debate things. Councillor Bells.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to my world next year, Councillor Bennett. More of a statement than a question. I've got a question later, but on 8 there's 22,465 unpaid carers in the 2021 census, and that number's obviously gone up, I should imagine, over the years. And the Carers Partnership supports 2,800. Which is an admirable, and they do a great job, etc. But there's a big gap there. I mean, how do we fill that gap? How do we reach out to them unpaid carers that are saving the council a lot of money?
What I'd say, Chair, is that there's a range of initiatives that the Carers Trust have been involved in promoting, and we work with them to publicise the availability, because what we seek to do is actually encourage as many carers as possible to go to Carers Trust, and using what's actually available to us. One of the key mediums is, of course, Hillingdon people. We've discussed at other meetings how they actually go out to the communities to inform people. And also working with partners through health partners, actually making people aware. What we will find with some of those figures is that there will be, as well as new people actually becoming carers, there will be existing carers who cease to in their caring role. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Gary. Just my other...
Yeah, with a good prompt to my colleagues. So obviously, as a local authority under the Care Act, we have a statutory responsibility to identify and assess carers. So obviously social workers, when they're out assessing residents, will also be identifying if there are any carers. So it's very proactive. And then just to add to Gary's list of partners, we also commission Admiral nurses. They have lots of events where they bring together carers of people living with dementia. So again, it's about supporting people. And equally, not everybody wants that formal support. Sometimes it's enough to drop into an informal session in a cafe environment and have a conversation. So it's not necessarily always about the local authority providing formal services. Sometimes it's about lining people up and making connections.
I think also the point about actually making people aware of where to go if they decide they actually want to access information, because not all people who are undertaking a caring role may not actually need support at that particular time or identify it's necessarily a need, but if they can actually see where to get the information from, then it's something in their consciousness that they can tap into should it become relevant at a future point.
Thank you. My other question was, where are we these days with smoking as a preventative? I know there's good work done at the Arch, down the road there, but it's not in one of the top priorities, although some of the outcomes of smoking with cancer, etc., are overriding, and vaping also comes into it.
So stop smoking is the single most modifiable factor that influences our health. Our prevalence in the borough is, again, it's linked to sort of deprivation. If you live in a more deprived area, the prevalence of smoking is much higher. On a borough level, I can't remember what the prevalence is off the top of my head, but it's lower than the rest of northwest London. But as I said, that sort of hides the fact that there are areas of the borough where smoking prevalence is significantly greater. We fund C&W Well to provide our stop smoking service, and they obviously provide our drug and alcohol services, so it's quite well connected. And we're also providing stop smoking services for women who are pregnant, to reduce the number of women who are smoking during pregnancy. As part of the 5-year strategy to tackle smoking levels, we've received quite a significant grant last year and this year to increase our activity and to increase the number of stop smoking advisors that we commission. We've more than doubled the service on the back of that 5-year grant, so we're taking it incredibly seriously and really targeting those communities to really get the quitters. This is the people who've had the interventions and the support to quit within 28 days of setting a quit date. So a lot of support is going into that service. In terms of vaping, also including kind of access to vapes. Now, vapes are a harm reduction measure to help people who are smoking cigarettes to stop smoking cigarettes and move them into a sort of a healthier harm reduction sort of activity as a means to step them towards or help them towards quitting entirely. We're also targeting schools because obviously what you've seen is that what particularly amongst young people is that young people who've never smoked have started to vape. So a lot of that kind of additional grant has really been targeted into working with schools to really get young people to understand that this is not a healthy option, vaping. It's a harm reduction if you are smoking, but it's unhealthy and not a sort of a good health activity to be taking up vaping if you're not smoking. So a lot of work is going on in that space. I think it's fair to say in the last 10 years that stop smoking, the kind of investment in stop smoking has reduced quite significantly. And it used to be one of the really highest priorities, and what we've really seen is that the smoking prevalence across all areas has reduced from sort of that really high level, say 10 to 20 years ago. So every time we have a quitter, it's something to celebrate, because these are people who are long-term smokers. But that additional investment is really making a difference, and we're being sort of managed in terms of the numbers of quitters that we're expected to deliver each year now with that additional investment.
Okay, so we've been going for over an hour now, so I'm going to go for the last question to Councillor Punja. Then I'm going to wrap it up for tonight, because obviously this is the beginning of our investigation. And so we're going to be spending a lot more time on this, but we've got a lot to think about. So Councillor Punja, last question of the night.
So forward planning and forward thinking, with the challenges facing the over 65s at the moment in terms of the need, what are the health assumptions of those that are going to be the next, I'll use the word cohort, it sounds like a weird word to use, of the next cohort going into that over 65s kind, because you've got the legacy of COVID that you're dealing with right now, but the next kind of tranche of people coming through, the legacy of COVID might not be as stark, let's use that word, and so therefore maybe there will be other issues. For example, as we see high streets being filled with fast food places, even in affluent areas, so the dietary requirements, so those things of diabetes, different kind of work challenges, hypertension, all those things that are related are going to be transferring to that group of people, but for different reasons.
We refer to them as the rising risk group. So 20% of that rising risk group nationally will fall into a frailty, roughly about 20% will fall into kind of the frailty cohort every year. That's where my responsibility sits. So my responsibility in the Hillingdon Health and Care Partnership and work with the Health and Wellbeing Board is how do we tackle that? How do we reduce the number of people who are living with multi-morbidities, the kind of combination of those factors that we spoke to about before, people whose lifestyle really does mean that they are, there's that significantly higher risk of developing some of the long-term conditions that are driven by lifestyle and behaviours, which increases their risk, and how do we keep people healthier? One of the things that we've spoken about is NHS health checks. Others is the kind of how do you increase sort of physical activity, get people active, and really the focus in that particular space is how do we get the inactive a little bit active rather than those people who are a little bit active more active, and you sort of drive that agenda. Access to healthy food, that's a lot of work that we're going to have to focus on to do that. One of the things that I'm tackling at the moment is unhealthy food advertising, which is sort of the industry, the unhealthy food industry, food high in sugar, fat and salt. It does target more deprived communities, things like chicken shops. But also what we have got is the opportunities of the council to think about how do we use our kind of planning restrictions on our planning responsibilities to really sort of, and our policies to restrict the advertisement, particularly to those more vulnerable groups. So there's lots to do in that space, but the mechanisms of the council, like I said right at the beginning, about how do we make the easiest option the healthiest option, or the healthiest option the easiest option? How do we make active travel, sort of how do we cycle ways, walking routes, safe spaces in our parks? How do we reduce the reliance on cars as our means of transport? How do we make sure that sort of healthy food is available in kind of local communities where people are less likely to access a supermarket and be relying on sort of parades of shops? So those are the kind of things that we need to start thinking about on top of all those other things that we've spoken about, which is, nice healthy walks, and we have kind of lots of physical activity instructors doing the kind of chair-based activity that Councillor Denys spoke about, but also how do we keep people, healthy, core strength, staying steady and less likely to fall over. All of those kind of things are a kind of a combination of that, going back to what I said was earlier about how do we create an age-friendly community where older people feel safe to be active and out and about rather than sitting home and kind of health deteriorating. But the rising risk group is a really big group. The kind of most recent data, as I said, is pretty stark, so we've got a long way to go to tackle that.
I think in terms of some information for us, what those rising risk groups look like and how we're thinking of tackling those will be really interesting, won't it? So at some point, I know we're asking you to come back to us with lots of information, but there's lots of really interesting stuff here. So, okay, well, thank you very much. That's been super interesting. Gavin, Gary and Kelly, really great to hear. So I am going to say, Gavin and Kelly, you're very welcome to leave. Gary, could you just stay when we talk about the work plan, just to make sure we get clear about your ideas that you've suggested? So hopefully it won't be too much longer, but anyway, so thank you very much. Okay. Right, so if we move to item 6, the Cabinet Forward Plan, does anybody have any comments on the Cabinet Forward Plan? No? Are we all good? Yep. Sorry? Oh yes, sorry, Councillor Cornwall.
The bit about Mount Vernon, I'm not sure, is it work programme or...
Work programme. I think that'll be work programme rather than cabinet.
I'll save it for now then.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so are we good to move on to the work programme?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So on the work programme, before we get into the stuff we were discussing earlier on, Councillor Cornwall raised something with me about Mount Vernon, which I think might be something that we might want to look at more in depth at a future date. So, Councillor Cornwall, if you'd like to share your point.
Just briefly, I'm sort of picking up indications, not from any official source, that the Mount Vernon Estates team are potentially looking at having some of the site developed. Be worth us knowing what's going on. Perhaps we can ask for that.
Yeah, so I did speak to the Hillingdon Hospital sort of estates team, and there are some plans being considered about areas of Mount Vernon, and that also made me think that hospital estates is such a big issue that comes up in the background of many things, that maybe we should have a bigger meeting, not just on the Mount Vernon stuff, which I think is good to investigate, but just in general about hospital estates and choices being made. And I'm not talking about the rebuild of the Hillingdon Hospital, of course, because we will do that anyway. Maybe even broad in terms of the NHS estates, in terms of, I know Keith sort of talks about it as well, so maybe if we have a broader item. In terms of fitting it in somewhere, I mean, Nikki, do you have any views about when it would be good to have that item?
Chair, I think we are definitely looking at next year, obviously, as in the next municipal year. Okay. So after May. So we currently have we're looking at a single meeting review in July. So
September?
Potentially September, yes.
So September? Yeah. So I know Councillor Cawthorne, you're obviously always welcome, even when you're mayor, if you wish to come and attend, or you can obviously watch on YouTube. And email your comments in, and they'll be read out or passed on, definitely. So, but yeah, if we pencil that sort of agenda item for September, looking at our programme, fantastic. So thank you. So Gary, in terms of the witnesses you sort of suggested, especially in terms of the technology, were you thinking of the technology piece feeding into this review, or it being a okay? And you were suggesting July would be a good time for that. Okay. So are we happy to put the technology piece that Philip was, that Councillor Cawthorne? July, you said July, didn't you? Yeah. So if we put that into there, yes. Could you put your microphone on? Thank you.
That was on the basis that we actually have the committee has the providers of under the new contracts attending the June meeting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're happy with that, definitely, because we will want to speak to them. So under the June meeting, and then we have a witness session, obviously next March, and you've listed a couple of ideas for that already, which I think we're happy to follow up with. Yep, so that's good. And obviously you're going to go away, you and others are going to think about maybe how we can go and visit some of the programmes and speak to some of the users in terms of collecting evidence as well.
We will look into that and share and come back to Nikki.
Brilliant. Okay, so is everybody happy with that? Yeah? Any other views on the work programme? We all good? Okay, brilliant. Okay, well I'll call this meeting to a close. Thank you.